The company that owned a country. How the East India Company became a financial monster. A private company with its own army of 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British military. A company that could wage wars, sign treaties, and execute prisoners. A company that controlled the drug trade across Asia and collected taxes from hundreds of millions of people. A company so powerful that it could hold the British government hostage for bailouts and dictate foreign policy to the most powerful empire on Earth. This wasn't a dystopian future. This was the East India Company from 1757 to 1857. And here's the part that should terrify you. It started as 218 merchants pooling money to buy spices. Most people think corporations answer to governments. The East India Company reversed that equation. It didn't lobby for influence, it purchased sovereignty. It didn't negotiate trade deals, it conquered territories and installed puppet rulers. And when it finally collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, it didn't just destroy itself. It triggered a rebellion that killed millions and forced the British government to nationalize an entire subcontinent. But here's the question nobody asks. How does a company go from trading pepper to ruling 400 million people? The answer isn't about business strategy or market dominance. It's about something far more dangerous. The moment when a corporation gains the power to make its own rules, enforce its own justice, and profit from violence without accountability. Because that story didn't end in 1857. The blueprint the East India Company created, privatized violence, corporate sovereignty, regulatory capture, and too-big-to-fail bailouts, is repeating right now. And by the end of this video, you'll see exactly which modern corporations are following the same playbook. To understand how a spice trading company became a military empire, we need to rewind to December 31st, 1600. Queen Elizabeth I grants a royal charter to the Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. The charter gives them a monopoly on English trade with everything east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan, basically all of Asia. But this isn't like a modern corporate charter. The document gives the company extraordinary powers: the right to wage war, the right to negotiate treaties with foreign powers, the right to establish settlements, the right to mint money, and the right to administer justice, including executions. In modern terms, Elizabeth I just gave a private business the powers of a sovereign nation. Why would she do this? Because in 1600, England is broke and weak. Spain controls the seas. Portugal dominates the Asian spice trade. The Dutch are building their own trading empire. England can't afford to compete through government expenditure, so they privatize imperialism. Let merchants take the financial risk of exploring trade routes and building infrastructure, and the crown will get a cut of the profits without the upfront investment. It's a deal that seems brilliant for both sides. The merchants get monopoly rights and sovereign powers. The crown gets expansion without expense. What could possibly go wrong? At first, nothing does. The East India Company starts cautiously. They send ships to Indonesia, India, and Persia to trade English wool and silver for pepper, cloves, indigo, and silk. The voyages are profitable but dangerous. Ships sink, pirates attack, local rulers demand bribes. Competition from Dutch and Portuguese traders is fierce. This is still recognizable as a trading company, buying low and selling high, taking commercial risks for commercial rewards. But in 1608, something changes. The company establishes its first permanent factory, a fortified trading post at Surat on the west coast of India. And fortified is the operative word. These aren't warehouses, they're armed compounds with walls, cannons, and private soldiers. Because the company has learned something crucial. In regions without stable governments or rule of law, violence is more profitable than negotiation. The Mughal Empire technically controls India in 1608, but its authority is fragmenting. Regional powers are rising, succession disputes are constant, and into this instability comes the East India Company with a new strategy: Don't just trade with local rulers, manipulate them. Play factions against each other. Offer military support in exchange for trading privileges. Turn commerce into leverage. But here's what nobody tells you about the company's rise. They weren't the strongest force in India. They weren't even close. For the first 150 years of their existence, they were just one trading company among many, often getting bullied by more powerful European rivals and local rulers. So how did they go from minor player to absolute ruler? The answer involves a single battle, a brilliant sociopath, and a loophole that turned a company into a government. The transformation of the East India Company from merchant to sovereign begins with a man named Robert Clive. In 1743, Clive arrives in India as a teenage clerk making £5 per year. He's not a brilliant businessman. He's not well connected. By his own admission, he's depressed and twice attempts suicide. But Clive has two talents that will make him rich and powerful. He's ruthless, and he understands that in India, military force determines commercial success. When war breaks out between Britain and France in 1744, Clive switches from clerk to soldier. He joins the company's private army and discovers he's good at violence. Not just fighting, strategy, manipulation, and psychological warfare. He wins battles against French forces and their Indian allies. The company promotes him, and Clive realizes something that will change history. The company doesn't need to trade for profits. It can conquer for them. In 1756, the opportunity arrives. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, attacks the company's fortified trading post in Calcutta. His forces capture the fort, and in the chaos, dozens of British prisoners die in a small prison cell overnight in an incident that becomes known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. The details are disputed, possibly exaggerated, but the company uses it as propaganda to justify revenge. Robert Clive is sent with a military force to recapture Calcutta, but Clive doesn't just want to retake the fort, he wants to take Bengal. The problem? The Nawab's army has 50,000 soldiers. Clive has 3,000, mostly Indian soldiers called sepoys, led by British officers. Fighting directly would be suicide. So Clive does something brilliant and evil. He bribes the Nawab's military commander, Mir Jafar, to betray his ruler. The deal is simple. Mir Jafar will hold his troops back during the battle, allowing Clive to win. In exchange, the company will make Mir Jafar the new Nawab of Bengal, and Mir Jafar will grant the company unlimited trading rights and massive reparations. On June 23, 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, Clive's forces face the Nawab's army. Mir Jafar keeps his promise. His troops stand idle. The battle is barely a battle. The Nawab's forces collapse. Siraj-ud-Dowlah flees and is later captured and executed. Mir Jafar becomes Nawab, and the East India Company becomes the real power in Bengal. But here's where the story takes its critical turn. Clive doesn't just take a favorable trade deal, he demands the power to collect taxes, the Diwani, from 20 million people in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Think about what this means. The East India Company, a private corporation chartered in London, now controls the tax revenue of one of the richest regions on Earth. They're not just trading in India, they own the government's revenue stream. The amount of money is staggering. Bengal's annual tax revenue is approximately £3 million, while the company's total annual trade revenue before Plassey was less than £1 million. In one battle, really one bribe, the company has tripled its income. And unlike trade, which requires ships, merchandise, and risk, tax collection is pure extraction. You just take money from millions of peasants who have no choice but to pay. Robert Clive returns to England fabulously wealthy. He brings back a personal fortune worth £234,000, roughly £300 million in today's money, looted from Bengal's treasury. He buys estates, seats in parliament, and respectability. When questioned about his wealth, he famously declares, "I stand astonished at my own moderation in not taking more." But Clive's greed is nothing compared to what the company is about to become. Once the East India Company discovers that conquering is more profitable than trading, there's no going back.
Between 1757 and 1857, the company will conquer nearly all of the Indian subcontinent. But this isn't nation-building, it's a protection racket scaled to continental proportions. Here's how the system works. The company arrives in a region and offers the local ruler a deal. Accept our trade monopoly and let us collect taxes, and we'll protect you with our army. If the ruler refuses, the company backs a rival who will cooperate. If there's no convenient rival, they manufacture succession disputes or provocations to justify invasion. Once they control the region, they impose devastating taxes and enforce them with military brutality. The efficiency is horrifying. Traditional rulers collected taxes but also had obligations to maintain infrastructure, provide famine relief, protect peasants, and maintain legitimacy through religious or cultural authority. The company has no such obligations. They're accountable only to shareholders in London who want maximum short-term returns, so they extract everything they can without regard for long-term consequences. Bengal becomes the testing ground for this model. The company demands higher taxes than the Mughals ever collected. When peasants can't pay, the company seizes their land and forces them to grow cash crops like indigo and opium instead of food. When famines strike, as they do in 1770, killing an estimated 10 million people, roughly one-third of Bengal's population, the company doesn't reduce taxes. They increase them to compensate for lost revenue from the dead. Let me say that again. 10 million people starve to death, and the company raises taxes on the survivors. This is economic extraction without any pretense of government. It's corporate colonialism in its purest form. Violence creates monopoly, monopoly generates profit, profit funds more violence. And the company keeps expanding. They conquer Delhi, the Mughal capital, in 1803. They conquer the wealthy regions of South India. They fight wars against the Maratha Confederacy, the Kingdom of Mysore, the Sikh Empire. Each conquest brings more territory, more taxes, more opium production, and more profit. By 1840, the East India Company directly controls or dominates most of the Indian subcontinent. They have an army of 260,000 soldiers, 200,000 Indian sepoys, and 60,000 British officers and troops. To put that in perspective, the entire British Army in 1840 has only 140,000 soldiers. A private company has nearly twice the military force of one of the great powers. But here's what's crucial to understand. This army isn't defending trade routes or protecting British citizens, it's enforcing corporate profit. When peasants resist taxes, the army crushes them. When local rulers challenge company authority, the army conquers them. When employees and soldiers demand fair treatment, the army suppresses them. Violence isn't a means to an end, it is the business model.
And the most profitable product of that business model is opium. The company has a problem in the late 1700s. They're buying massive amounts of tea from China, but China doesn't want British manufactured goods. The Chinese want silver, which drains British reserves. So the company creates a product China will buy, opium grown in India. They force Indian peasants to grow opium, process it, and then the company smuggles it into China, creating millions of addicts and draining Chinese silver back to Britain. When the Chinese government tries to stop the opium trade in 1839, the company, backed by the British military, wages war on China, twice. They win both opium wars and force China to legalize the drug trade and pay reparations. A private company has just gone to war with one of the world's oldest civilizations to protect its drug trafficking business, and it worked. By the 1850s, the East India Company is the most powerful corporation in history. It controls 400 million people. It collects more tax revenue than most European nations. It has its own military, its own territories, and its own foreign policy. It's theoretically subordinate to the British Crown, but in practice it operates as an independent power. But beneath the appearance of success, the company is rotting from within, and the explosion, when it comes, will be catastrophic. The problem with building an empire on extraction and violence is that eventually the people you're extracting from fight back, and the people you're using as weapons realize they're being exploited too. By 1857, the East India Company's army is full of Indian sepoys who are watching their country being destroyed by the corporation they serve. They're paid less than British soldiers, they're treated with contempt, they're forced to participate in conquests of their own people, and they're starting to see that the company's promises of honor and glory are lies designed to profit British shareholders. The spark that ignites the rebellion is almost absurdly small: rifle cartridges. The company introduces new Enfield rifles that require soldiers to bite open paper cartridges greased with animal fat. Rumors spread that the grease contains cow fat, offensive to Hindus, and pig fat, offensive to Muslims. Whether true or not doesn't matter. It's a symbol of the company's disrespect for Indian culture and religion. On May 10, 1857, sepoys in Meerut mutiny. They kill their British officers. They march to Delhi and declare the restoration of the Mughal emperor. The rebellion spreads across northern India. Sepoys desert, peasants join the uprising. Local rulers who'd been conquered by the company see an opportunity for revenge. What follows is one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 19th century. The company responds to the rebellion with systematic brutality. Entire villages suspected of supporting rebels are burned. Prisoners are blown apart by cannons as public executions. British newspapers call for the extermination of rebels. The racism that had always underpinned company rule becomes explicit. Indians aren't just subjects to be exploited, they're savages to be punished. The rebels are equally brutal. British civilians are massacred, women and children are killed. The violence becomes a cycle of atrocity and revenge, and caught in the middle are millions of ordinary Indians who just want the killing to stop. The company eventually crushes the rebellion, but the cost is staggering. Estimates of deaths range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. The company's reputation is destroyed, its financial position is revealed as a fraud, and most importantly, the British government realizes it can no longer allow a private company to control a subcontinent. Because here's what the rebellion exposed: the company wasn't just corrupt and brutal, it was functionally bankrupt. All the wealth it extracted from India wasn't being invested in development or even efficiently returned to shareholders. It was being stolen by company officials, wasted on wars of conquest, and used to pay dividends to disguise the underlying insolvency. The company had pioneered what we now call creative accounting. They classified military expenses as investments. They borrowed money against future tax collection. They manipulated stock prices to attract capital. They paid dividends from borrowed money to maintain confidence. It was, in essence, a massive fraud, enabled by the fact that the company controlled the territory it was supposedly governing. When the British government audited the company after the rebellion, they discovered the scope of the disaster. The company owed £70 million, an almost incomprehensible sum equivalent to roughly $8 billion today. Its administration was riddled with corruption, its military was expensive and unreliable, its territories were impoverished by over-extraction. In 1858, the British government does what governments always do with too-big-to-fail corporations. They bail it out. The Government of India Act transfers all company territories, assets, and obligations to the British Crown. The company is effectively nationalized. Its shareholders are bought out, its private army becomes the British Indian Army, and direct colonial rule by the British government replaces corporate colonialism. The East India Company limps along as a trading entity until 1874, when it's finally dissolved. The company that once owned a country becomes a footnote in history books. But its legacy doesn't end. It transforms into something arguably worse: direct imperial rule that will last another 90 years.
Here's what they don't teach you about the East India Company's collapse. The transfer from corporate rule to government rule didn't help Indians at all. If anything, it made extraction more efficient. The British Crown inherits all the company's systems of exploitation: the tax collection, the land seizure, the forced cash crop production, the opium trade, but now with the full authority of the British Empire behind it. The company had to at least pretend to answer to shareholders. The Crown answers to no one in India. Between 1857 and 1947, British colonial rule will drain an estimated $45 trillion from India through trade manipulation, taxation, and resource extraction. Famines will kill tens of millions. Resources that could have industrialized India are shipped to Britain, and the entire enterprise is justified through racist ideology that says Indians need British civilization. But here's the question we need to ask. Why did Britain allow the East India Company to become so powerful in the first place? The answer reveals something disturbing about how governments treat corporations that serve their interests. For 250 years, the British government knew exactly what the company was doing. They received reports of famines. They knew about the opium trade. They understood the company was conquering territories through bribery and violence. And they did nothing to stop it because the company was profitable for Britain. The company lobbied Parliament relentlessly. They bribed politicians. They employed former company officials to write laws that benefited the company. They threatened that if Parliament restricted their power, trade would suffer and Britain would lose out to European rivals. It was regulatory capture at a scale never seen before. When the company faced bankruptcy in 1772, yes, this happened repeatedly, Parliament bailed them out with the Tea Act, which gave the company monopoly rights to sell tea in the American colonies without paying taxes. That Tea Act, by the way, led to the Boston Tea Party and contributed to the American Revolution. The East India Company's corruption literally helped spark American independence. And when the company faced bankruptcy again in 1784, Parliament passed the India Act, giving the government more oversight but fundamentally preserving company power. And again in 1813, and again in 1833. Each time, Parliament had the opportunity to dismantle the company's sovereign powers. Each time they chose to prop it up instead. Why? Because the company was too big to fail before we had a term for it. Its collapse would have destroyed thousands of British investors, disrupted global trade, and embarrassed the government that had chartered it. So they kept bailing it out and looking the other way while the company committed atrocities in their name. The lesson the British government learned from the company wasn't don't give sovereign powers to corporations. It was when corporations abuse sovereign powers and face consequences, nationalize the profits and socialize the losses. That lesson has been remembered by every government since. Here's what should keep you up at night. The East India Company's playbook is being used right now by corporations across the world. The specific tactics have evolved, but the strategy remains identical. Gain power beyond democratic accountability, use that power to eliminate competition, and become so essential that governments have no choice but to protect you. Let's start with the obvious parallel: private military contractors. The East India Company had a private army. Today, companies like Blackwater, now Academy, provide military services to governments. At its peak, Blackwater had 20,000 contractors operating in conflict zones. They conducted combat operations, provided security, trained foreign militaries, functions that used to be exclusively government monopolies. And like the company's sepoys, these contractors operate in legal gray zones. When Blackwater contractors killed 17 Iraqi civilians in Nisour Square in 2007, they initially couldn't be prosecuted because they claimed immunity under Iraqi law and U.S. military law didn't clearly apply to contractors. It took years of legal battles to secure any accountability. The company would recognize this perfectly: privatize violence, maximize profit, minimize accountability. But the parallels go far deeper than private military contractors. Look at corporate sovereignty. The East India Company had the power to negotiate treaties and control territory. Today, multinational corporations negotiate trade agreements that override national laws. The investor-state dispute settlement system allows corporations to sue governments for passing laws that hurt profits, environmental regulations, labor protections, public health measures. Philip Morris sued Uruguay for requiring health warnings on cigarette packages. Vattenfall sued Germany for phasing out nuclear power. Chevron fought Ecuador's environmental laws for years. These aren't businesses asking for fair treatment. These are corporations claiming that their profit rights supersede democratic governance. The company operated the same way. Local laws didn't apply because corporate charter gave them sovereign immunity. Or consider regulatory capture.
The East India Company wrote the trade rules it operated under by bribing Parliament and employing former officials as lobbyists. Today, this is standard practice. Financial companies write banking regulations. Pharmaceutical companies write drug approval processes. Tech companies write privacy laws. The revolving door between corporate leadership and regulatory agencies ensures that the rules favor the companies being regulated. When Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank collapsed in 2023, the Federal Reserve and Treasury Department immediately guaranteed all deposits, not just the $250,000 that's legally insured, but all deposits, including those from wealthy corporations and venture capital firms. Why? Because tech industry lobbying convinced regulators that letting these banks fail would cause systemic damage. The East India Company got the same treatment for 2 centuries. And then there's the too big to fail doctrine. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, governments bailed out banks with trillions in public money. The justification? These banks were so interconnected with the economy that their collapse would destroy everything. The banks privatized profits for years, then socialized losses when their risky bets failed. The East India Company did the exact same thing. Extracted wealth from India, paid dividends to shareholders, then demanded government bailouts when their corrupt system collapsed.
But perhaps the most disturbing parallel is algorithmic extraction. The East India Company figured out how to systematically extract maximum wealth from millions of people through taxation and monopoly control. Modern tech companies do the same thing through data extraction and attention monopolies. Facebook extracts personal data from 3 billion users, uses it to create addictive algorithms, and sells advertising based on psychological manipulation. Google monopolizes search and uses that monopoly to control which businesses succeed or fail. Amazon uses seller data to identify profitable products, then creates competing products and manipulates search results to favor their own goods. TikTok, owned by ByteDance, optimizes for maximum engagement regardless of social harm. These companies don't use violence like the East India Company did. They don't need to. They've figured out how to extract value through manipulation, monopoly, and addiction while maintaining a veneer of being just another business. The company forced Indian peasants to grow opium. Tech companies engineer addiction to their products. The mechanism is different, the extraction is the same. And when governments try to regulate these companies, they face the same threats the East India Company made to Parliament. Restrict us and you'll damage the economy, lose competitive advantage to other nations, and hurt your own citizens who depend on our services. It's corporate hostage-taking disguised as economic necessity. The most chilling statistic, as of 2023, Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Google, Amazon, and Meta, Facebook, have a combined market capitalization exceeding $8 trillion, larger than the GDP of every country except the United States and China. The East India Company, at its peak, was valued at roughly £4 million when Britain's GDP was £200 million, 2% of national wealth. Today's tech giants represent a much larger percentage of global economic power. And unlike the East India Company, which was limited to one geographic region, these companies operate globally with minimal oversight. They're subject to no single nation's laws, but wield influence over all nations' policies. They're the company's model perfected: power without sovereignty, profit without accountability, and influence without democratic legitimacy. So what are the lessons from the East India Company that matter today? First, when corporations gain sovereign powers, the ability to make rules, enforce decisions, and avoid accountability, they will abuse those powers without exception. The East India Company started with a trade charter and ended with an empire built on extraction and violence. Every step of that transformation was rational from the company's perspective: maximize shareholder returns by gaining more power, using that power to eliminate competition, and exploiting the resulting monopoly. The company didn't become evil through accident or bad leadership. It became evil through following its incentive structure to logical conclusions. When you see modern corporations lobbying for self-regulation, negotiating treaties that supersede national laws, or claiming they're too big to fail, understand that you're watching the same process unfold. The incentives haven't changed. The outcomes won't either.
Second, the relationship between government and powerful corporations is not regulation, it's negotiation between powers. The British government didn't regulate the East India Company, it negotiated with the company as a separate power center, sometimes cooperating, sometimes conflicting, but always recognizing the company's independence. Parliament could pass laws affecting the company, but the company could threaten economic damage, fund opposing politicians, or simply ignore rules in territories it controlled. The fantasy that democratic governments control corporations through regulation ignores this power dynamic. When governments bail out failing banks, allow tech monopolies to continue, or let pharmaceutical companies set drug prices, it's not regulatory capture, it's recognition that these corporations have enough economic power to harm governments that oppose them. The East India Company held Britain hostage with threats of economic damage. Today's corporate giants do the same. Third, the ultimate cost of corporate power is always paid by the powerless. The East India Company's shareholders made fortunes, British merchants benefited from monopolized trade, company officials became wealthy beyond imagination. The cost, famines, wars, exploitation, death, was paid by millions of Indians who had no voice in company decisions and no recourse against company violence. Today, when corporations externalize costs, environmental damage, labor exploitation, consumer harm, systemic financial risk, the people who pay are always those with the least power to resist. When tech companies sell user data, it's vulnerable populations who suffer identity theft and manipulation. When pharmaceutical companies raise prices, it's the poor who die from lack of access. When banks take excessive risks, it's working families who lose homes in the crash. The distribution of profit and harm is never symmetrical. The powerful take the profit, the powerless take the harm. Now, here's the warning we need to confront. The East India Company was dissolved, its abuses ended, justice eventually prevailed. Except none of that is true.
The company wasn't dissolved because of moral awakening or democratic accountability. It was dissolved because it became a liability to the British government after the 1857 rebellion. The abuse didn't end. It was transferred to direct British colonial rule that lasted another 90 years. And justice never came. Not a single company official was prosecuted for the famines, the wars, the extraction that killed millions. They retired wealthy. Their descendants inherited that wealth, and the systems they built continued long after the company's name was erased. The danger of learning history is believing that problems from the past have been solved. The East India Company isn't a cautionary tale about what could happen. It's a template for what is happening. The mechanisms of corporate power that the company pioneered, regulatory capture, too-big-to-fail protection, privatized violence, extraction through monopoly, sovereignty without accountability, are more sophisticated now but fundamentally unchanged. And here's the question that should haunt us. If it took a rebellion that killed over 1 million people to even partially dismantle the East India Company's power, and the result was just a transfer of that power to another entity, what will it take to dismantle the corporate power structures that exist today? And what guarantee do we have that the result will be any better? The East India Company proves that hoping powerful institutions will restrain themselves is fantasy. They restrain themselves only when forced to by consequences they cannot avoid or buy their way out of. And they become powerful enough to avoid consequences by the same mechanisms that made them powerful in the first place. The company that owned a country teaches us that the distance between commerce and conquest, between business and empire, between profit and violence, is much shorter than we want to believe. And that distance shrinks every time we allow corporations to gain power beyond democratic accountability. Every time governments bail out failing companies to prevent economic pain, and every time we tell ourselves that this time will be different. Because it never is. The names change, the geography changes, the specific tactics evolve, but the pattern remains. Unchecked corporate power leads to extraction, extraction requires violence or coercion to sustain, and by the time enough people suffer to demand change, the system is too entrenched to reform without catastrophic conflict.
The East India Company isn't ancient history. It's a mirror showing us exactly where concentrated corporate power leads when checked only by profit motive and protected by governments that prioritize stability over justice. If this video changed how you think about corporate power and sovereignty, subscribe because we're exploring the patterns that keep repeating in economic and political history. And if you want to understand how monopolies actually get built and protected, check out the video on Standard Oil and the original Too Big to Fail corporation. The tactics are surprisingly similar.